Greetings. My name is Luis Molina, and I'm the host of the Life Puro podcast. In today's conversation, I speak to Sid Gray, who is an architectural historian and restoration specialist. I've come to know Sid over the years through our mutual love of cigars. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation, so feel free to light up a cigar. If you don't have a cigar, check out our website at shop.habanaport.com. Thank you. But yeah, I know that you are a fan of the lighter shade wrappers, usually the 60 ring gauge format.
Yeah, I'm really stuck on the 60s. Although last week, I noticed those Buena Vistas up by the front door. And I asked for something smaller. And I was told that I was given one that was supposed to have the same wrapper, is what they told me. And it was good. So whatever that is, it's about a 50 ring gauge, maybe.
Yeah, was that the first time you had that one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep, that's from it's Nicaraguan origin. That's Curivari is the name of the company. The brand that you smoked is the Buenaventura Crema. And so they made a splash in the cigar world when they got the number 6 ranking in Cigar Aficionado's top 25 list, probably in like 2012 or 13. But they got it for a different version. It was like their sun-grown version. The Crema is their light shade, their Connecticut shade, essentially. But yeah, that's a good one. So glad you got a chance to try that one too. Yeah, the Buenaventura series is just one of our best-selling series. So as you're lighting it, I'm excited to talking tonight with you. We over the years you've probably been shopping with us since the beginning, right? Since we first opened up.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So that was back in 2012. So 11 years now.
Really?
And just over the years, you and I have had good discussions, conversations. You've enlightened me on all sorts of stuff: the history of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the river, the function of the river here, the geography, the landscape. So I've learned a lot. So when we decided to undertake this endeavor, this podcast initiative, you were one of the first people on my list that I got to get you on camera. So you can share your insight to our audience. So thanks for coming again tonight. So I guess before we jump into your career, who are you? We know it's Sid Gray.
Sid Gray.
But where'd you grow up? Where are you from? You're not originally from here.
No, I'm from Rhode Island.
Okay.
And, people always ask me, well, how'd you get down here?
Mm-hmm.
I came to go to LSU and studied architecture. But I was fascinated by how different it is down here. And I have I don't know if he's a mentor, an old guy named Fred Niffen that came here from northern Minnesota, right on the Canadian border. And he came in 1929 as a culture geographer. He just graduated with a degree in culture geography. And when I look at his work and where he came from, Minnesota, he must have been dumbfounded because it's so different down here. And of course, for me, it was turned out to be historic buildings that I call old. I just call them old buildings. You can have old churches and old houses and old cigar shops, I suppose, but they're all old buildings to me. And I was just amazed at how many there were. This is, back in the late 60s. Fred Niffen was driving it was like a Model T or something. I don't know what people were driving in 1929. He was taking pictures. As you went down the river road, there were houses one right after the other. We have his old black and white photographs to look at, with the serrated edges on them, the old Kodak.
Yeah.
So I kind of got involved with the field of culture geography, which is what Fred Niffen taught.
So is that like? So I thought you did graduate with in architecture with a degree in architecture, correct?
Yes.
So is that focus or concentration cultural anthropology? Is that similar to architecture, or I guess there are components of that in architecture?
No, but I was not particularly interested in designing new buildings. It just didn't. It wasn't. Honestly, I'll probably offend some of my classmates if they ever hear this. I didn't consider the study of architecture an intellectual pursuit. It was just back then it could probably be better thought of as just a trade school, kind of.
I see. Right. Like a plumber or electrician.
Yeah, it was I don't know if it'd be called a craft, but that's what I did in high school. We took a drafting class, and I always wanted to be an artist. And my art teacher in high school suggested that if I was to go to college, I should study architecture because I would never be able to make a living as an artist.
Oh, yeah. Starving artist.
So that's kind of how that wound up. I applied and got accepted to LSU. But honestly, I tell people I was really running away from home. My whole family lived within a block of each other practically. Back when people would just walk in the house, we didn't lock the doors. And who knew was going to walk? Just one of my relatives.
Yeah.
So I say I ran away from home.
But how did you choose LSU of all places? You could have gone anywhere. I mean, did you have family or did you read something about South Louisiana?
LSU was cheap.
Okay.
It was $300 a semester.
Okay. Well, that's a good incentive.
That was out of state.
Wow. That's a good reason. Okay.
Yeah.
So I imagine you were researching different colleges and universities. You just didn't have LSU in your focus right away.
No, I didn't. I didn't take it that seriously.
Okay.
It was just a given. I was back then it was the beginning of what was called accelerated classes. So I got put in the 7th grade. I got put in an accelerated class. And it really put me in a room full of people that were not really I felt like I was from a different class of people. Like I was, my dad was a TV salesman. And I was smart. I could keep up with these kids, their parents were doctors and lawyers and stuff. So it was just assumed that we were all going to college. All the kids, that's why they put you in the accelerated class. It was assumed you were going to college. But it was never something that was seriously discussed. Although my father was the first college graduate from his whole family. His parents were Irish immigrants. And, they had 10 or 12 kids. I think he had 11 brothers. And he was the only one to go to college from his family. But we never discussed, the things that, like you asked me about, was I considering? No. I think LSU must have been the first one I applied for and got accepted. And I said, hey, let's go.
So when you enroll and it's fall semester, I imagine, first time you walk on campus, probably the first time you visit Louisiana, what was it like? Like culture, like shell shock?
Yeah.
Or culture shock, I mean.
Yeah. So it was, probably the second week of August, I suppose. And I get on the plane, or I get off the plane in what was called Moisant back then.
MSY.
And I had a wool herringbone jacket. I was a college boy with the leather on the elbows.
Yeah.
And
in August. Yeah.
So I get my suitcase. I walk to the front door, walk out the door, and it felt like I was walking in an oven. Like I walked straight into the oven.
Yeah.
And the what I guess those guys are called porters.
Mm-hmm.
I asked them, how do I get to Baton Rouge? Which way is Baton Rouge?
Oh, no.
So he says, you walk down this road, it went straight to the airline highway, and you wait for the bus. It didn't even come down to the airport. You had to walk to the airline highway. And we're going up the airline highway, and it's still like that today. Those ditches on the side of the road.
Yeah.
I could have been in deepest, darkest Africa for all I knew.
Mm-hmm.
I was, it was like I was on another planet.
Yeah, you see, you're riding along with the bayous on either side of you.
And all those
this new terrain, this new
all those
foliage.
trees, the trees that fall in the bayou, they look like alligators sometimes.
Yeah, and I'm sure you saw some alligators on the way, huh?
Yeah, probably did, but
yeah.
I thought they were all alligators.
Yeah. So you study at LSU, you get a degree in architecture, and from there, where's your career take you? When you graduated, did you work for a firm? Did you go out on your own?
No, I joined the Vista Volunteers. You've heard of that?
No.
It's the domestic version of the Peace Corps. Peace Corps was international, so it was a domestic version, and I don't even remember how that came about. But anyway, I joined and got stationed in New Orleans, where the plan was to work for an architectural firm. But the architects in New Orleans didn't want young people like myself. I mean, this is my memory of it.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't want us working for free. It was something about interfering with their profession. They just didn't want it. So the architecture thing never did happen. So I got involved with a group called NOVAC, which is a what are those acronyms?
Yeah.
For New Orleans Video Access Center. And there's this fella here may know of that because there's one in Baton Rouge. They have a branch in Baton Rouge now, and it's been here for a few years. I think they use it to teach young kids that want to get in the film industry, video and whatnot. But a group of us, I think it was brand new at the time, so we were right on the ground floor, and I can remember we were doing a sort of investigative journalism in the city of New Orleans as it related to housing, fair housing kind of a thing. I can remember taking a camera into the city council chambers in New Orleans and we got promptly thrown out of the city council chamber.
I didn't like that.
They didn't like it at all. This was 1971. I mean, I came here in 65, and back home in Rhode Island, we knew there was this thing called civil rights going on, but it didn't have any meaning in Rhode Island till I got down here.
Mm.
And of course, there were, signs, colored water fountains, colored bathrooms.
Mm-hmm.
I was, man, where am I? Kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But it worked out. I graduated. I did well. Graduated on the dean's list.
Oh, wow.
Spent about not quite a year in New Orleans. And that was just fabulous. I mean, again, I could have been in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
It was that cool. It's that different from, I use the word Anglo, but I was raised in the Baptist church. So that's Protestant, It seemed like back then there was Protestant, Catholic, and Jews. Those were the three, it's not like it is today. I don't even think young kids today make those kind of distinctions anymore. But back then it was significant, certainly growing up in Rhode Island, which was Rhode Island goes back to colonial days. And I'm talking, 1620. If you've ever been to Plymouth Rock, that's the date that somebody inscribed on Plymouth Rock, 1620, when the Pilgrims landed. Mm-hmm. So it's heavily Protestant. Of course, all my buddies were Catholics. Lots of Portuguese people. My best friend was Portuguese. Lots of Italian people. All Catholics. Down here, it's more like, Louisiana, you had to be Catholic. I'm talking colonial times. The French and the Spanish in particular, you had to be Catholic. You had to sign allegiance to the king. And, the Acadians that eventually got brought here, they got thrown out of Nova Scotia because they wouldn't sign allegiance to the British king. So the Spanish put out the call for warm bodies. They didn't say warm bodies, but that they wanted people on the border between French and Spanish-owned Louisiana and British-owned Louisiana, actually called West Florida at the time. And that's the dividing line was the Bayou Manchac, which is where I live now. I live on the banks of the Bayou Manchac. Of course, this is, I'm sort of jumping in time here. When I finished as a Vista volunteer and came back to Baton Rouge, I got a job as a carpenter. Had no carpentry experience, but I got a job as a carpenter. And wound up, I remember we were working downtown Baton Rouge, what's called Beauregard Town. It was right at the beginning of people being interested in fixing up old buildings. And so we were working on an old house to make it into a law office. So one of the attorneys, whose law office that was, asked me if I wanted to work on another old building that was going to be his house. And that house was on Plaquemine Point, which is south of here or downriver from here, and on the River Road. His house was on the River Road.
Okay.
But really, I'm just remembering this. I haven't thought of this in such a long time. He really hired me to build a geodesic dome, which is, I got interested while I was in architecture school in a guy named Buckminster Fuller. And Buckminster Fuller is known as the inventor of the geodesic dome. And back then...
I was going to ask, explain that. Is that like Epcot Center? Like the big structural, that globe that you see in Epcot?
Yeah. Trying to think. Well, there was a group of guys out of California that created, it was 11 by 17 format. It was called the Whole Earth Catalog. Again, this is the 60s, the beginning of hippies.
Okay.
And Whole Earth Catalog, I mean, these guys were from Harvard and where else? I think Berkeley.
Okay.
So it was the beginning of even these guys were working on even computers, I think. But this is the very beginning, of coding stuff. So one of these guys, his name was Stuart Brand. He creates the Whole Earth Catalog, and it's like a kind of like a buyer's guide of how to live. You've heard the term back to the earth. It's even been called a movement, back to the earth movement.
Yeah. Like going organic or living off the earth.
Yeah. Moving out to the country.
Mm-hmm.
I know one of my favorite songs, Taj Mahal songs. Going to move up to the country and paint my mailbox blue.
Okay.
Yeah, so lots of people moving to the country. And this lawyer, well, I got fascinated by Buckminster Fuller, built a couple of geodesic domes. Of course, I had to do it from scratch, but the one thing the Whole Earth Catalog was good at, they'd choose certain topics or certain items or whatnot, and they'd have explanatory paragraphs. So they also published the Dome Builders book. That's what it was, which I still have a copy of. It's made out of newsprint, and I saved it. It's probably, last time I looked, it was worth $10.
Oh, there you go.
It might be worth $20 now, but a very fragile, ephemeral thing, because it was meant to be cheap. The whole Earth Catalog was meant to be cheap. It was
accessible by everyone, huh?
Yeah. So I built a couple of domes, and this attorney, he had this property on Plaquemine Point, and most of the River Road, going all the way to New Orleans and beyond, were plantations, mostly sugarcane plantations. And so there are still a few sugar mills that survive. Of course, the chimneys. You've seen the chimneys,
Yes, sir.
big tall chimneys.
Mhm.
That was always associated with the sugar mill. So he had a foundation. Sugar mill was long gone, but he still had foundations. So we built the geodesic dome on top of the sugar mill foundation. And while I was doing that, he and his wife were going to live in the geodesic dome while he was fixing up this old house. And he asked me, and I said, sure. So that was my first old building project. And I never looked back. I mean, it was, for me, it was my architectural substitute. And I just fell in with it. It suited me, because it was existing. So I didn't have to know how to build a new house or whatever. It's something, it's something I am still very much involved in to this day. But I tell people all the time about when I was starting out, I thought the old houses were mostly all gone. And of course they by and large were. But still to this day, I still have that thought that they're mostly gone. I went on a field trip last week and saw 3 or 4 buildings I'd never seen before. Well, 2 of them were barns, but one of them was a big old plantation house that I'd never seen before. So they're still around. They're pretty rare. But back then, looking back, there were lots of old buildings. But still, I thought they were mostly gone. So I guess it's more a question of there are still old abandoned buildings. I don't think if you were up in New England, for example, I don't think you'd see, there are probably very few abandoned buildings. But around here, I think because of the Civil War primarily, and plantations lost their labor component, and many people went bankrupt. And it's interesting that the ones that survive to this day, apparently there was a fairly significant economic, recession, maybe. So families that wanted to save their property started forming corporations. And many people that I've worked for over the years, I was working for family corporations. They still exist to this day. It was a way for them to, pool their money maybe and save the old property and the old house. So where you asked me, what did you ask me?
Well, I guess you had to explain, maybe help me out with the notion of like the river, how important it is with, I guess, in your line of work with a lot of these old houses. I was watching the documentaries that you sent me that you were a part of. And one thing I thought was interesting was like the relationship between like this industry along the river, the present day, I guess, like these chemical companies or petrochemical companies along the river. And I guess they bought like these old plantation home plots. And there's one example, I can't remember the name of the house. Was it the Wellington House that got demolished by one of these corporations? Because they didn't want the house. They bought the land. That's what they were after, right? Because of this access to the river.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can expand on that, but it was just kind of sad, that one example. And it was in that IA House documentary. And yeah, it just seemed kind of sad that this industry they didn't care about the past. Let's just demolish this building. We need the land. But there's also a movement, a group that try to help and save these houses.
Yeah, as soon as Louisiana becomes a state, the Anglos start coming in. And the guys that had money to invest in sugar were buying. There's a going back to when Spanish governed Louisiana, they developed a system of land surveying as a way of giving these new people coming in many cases Acadians, and they'd give them small little strips of land. The unit of measurement was an arpent. Arpent is 192 linear feet. So they were giving them little strips of land, maybe 3 or 4 arpents, maybe 6 or 7 arpents, and it was dependent on your family and how many children you had and if you were a farmer. And so there were these, when I talked about Fred Niffen earlier and how the houses were kind of one right after the other, when the Anglos come in, again, beginning at statehood, but really they get up to speed in the 1820s, and they would buy up those little pieces of land to get a much bigger plantation-sized sugar operation. So that's how along the river, the river was...
And that was more desired land back then, correct?
Absolutely. I guess primarily because the Mississippi River, was the major transportation corridor. But when you look at land, particularly along the river, if we were to take a cross section through the land that's immediately next to the river is the high ground, and it gradually tapers as it goes towards the back. And they would build. The high ground is called a natural levee, and it's when the river floods, it deposits the heaviest soil immediately. That's why you get these banks right adjacent to the river. And so that was the obvious place to put a house of some kind. And yeah, both sides of the river, all the way to New Orleans and beyond.
So I guess to give some insight to the viewer, especially viewers are not from Louisiana, the Mississippi River, can you tell me a little bit about, I guess, the function of that river in terms of, like, over time? This is before, I guess, the Corps or whatever group was first to build these massive levees to contain this winding river. Can you explain a little bit about that? And also, like, what happens with, like, the bluff, like Highland Road? What does that all mean in terms of the Mississippi River?
Yeah, the Mississippi River, to give you a sense of scale, the Great Flood of 27 or 29, I forget.
Yeah.
I think it's 27. The flood extended from the bluff in Baton Rouge to the bluff in Opelousas. It's about 80 miles. It was completely underwater.
What? All that was underwater at one
Yeah.
point? How deep was it?
Not
few
very
feet?
deep. Again, inches can mean a lot in South Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, most of I say, if you have a crawl space, if you live in a house that has a crawl space, and a crawl space, I mean the house is raised up off the ground.
Okay.
Maybe just a couple of feet. Old houses can be a full story off the ground. If you have a house with a crawl space, you live in an old house. And there isn't any written documentation that I'm aware of. I'm sure there is. I just haven't seen it. But how the first people, the first Europeans, didn't have a clue. I mean, I've done jobs in Illinois. Is it Illinois? I think so. They have a French fort in Illinois that's in the middle of the river. That's how little they knew that they would build a fort in a place that floods. And the Mississippi River back then, before levees, could flood 2 or 3 times a year. So they very quickly learned that you had to raise the houses. And in New Orleans, they have a term, it's raised basement, is a uniquely New Orleans term.
Raised
basement.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess that's another reason why we don't see basements in this part of the country, just because of the water issues.
The water table.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what's the water table for people that don't understand that?
It's the water that stays permanently in the ground and attains a certain level that's kind of permanent. And that's, I guess, the top is where the term water table comes from, the top level.
Okay.
So, yeah, out where I live, I can get a shovel, and the water table, depending on if we're in rainy season, can be 6 inches below grade.
So you dig, and right away there's water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it floods real easy.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to your question, the question you asked about the river.
And I guess I'm bringing that up just in terms of, obviously, the people back then, the European, the people who arrived from Europe to New Orleans or South Louisiana, they obviously had to contend with the river and the moisture and take that all into account. And I guess what I'm getting at is that why, like, our architecture is different in this part of the country compared to, like, New England?
Well, no, the architecture is different because they were French.
Okay. So maybe expand on that, like the French Creole or versus Acadiana style of housing or architecture.
Well, it gets confusing even for me, especially the Creole part. But French and British people never got along. They still don't get along. I guess
Okay,
I don't know if it's French. Maybe people don't get along with French people. But anyway, they never got along. But because of cultural differences, the buildings were different. So the French, I mean, it was done all over the world, during the colonial period. They would go and settle different geographic areas, but the buildings they would build were just like the buildings they knew at home.
Okay.
Early colonial architecture was done primarily by military people. So the French buildings were in Louisiana were primarily timber frame is the term,
Okay.
and that's think of medieval architecture. Medieval architecture we know of as sometimes the term is heavy timber framing. So that's what was brought to Louisiana, as early as, New Orleans was developed, founded in 1720, but they were farther east in Mobile was one of the first places that the French settled. Dolphin Island, which is still there to this day. But what they noticed right away, because of the harsh environment in Louisiana, lots of rain, lots of humidity, lots of hurricanes, the buildings were deteriorating rapidly. For example, the first St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans, in less than 10 years, it deteriorated so quickly they had to build another one. The St. Louis Cathedral that's in the quarter now is the third building.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that was true of all these early military buildings, including the Ursuline Convent. The first one was built in 1927. The one that's there now is the second. Same thing, it deteriorated rapidly. So the second one was built 1745.
So why did it deteriorate? What was it? The building material was just the wrong choice? I would imagine it would have been like stone or.
No, it was wood.
Okay.
There's no stone in Louisiana.
Okay. And obviously they didn't have cement, right? That they could make back then.
They didn't have cement.
Bricks?
They had bricks, but getting the right kind of clay was difficult. Still to this day, there was a brick plant manufacturing bricks in North Baton Rouge. But when you're up in the northern, if we leave here and we drive north, by the time you get to North Baton Rouge, the soil starts to change. And of course, the farther north you go. But the soil you get down here, which is primarily river soil, and it's mostly clay, is not very good for making bricks.
Okay.
So it was timber.
And what kind of timber would they use?
Cypress.
Okay.
And again, we're talking about the, what's the term? The original cypress forests, trees that were 2,000 to 3,000 years old, giant trees, giant cypress trees. But that's not what they were using, because you needed, they didn't start fooling with the big trees till the steam engine was developed. You needed a source of power to handle those big trees. So I'm talking, and if we use 1820 as a good starting point when you start to see steam power up and running. But we're talking early 18th century, 1720. They had to use fairly small trees, maybe 18, 20 inches in diameter. They couldn't have been more than, maybe 30, 40 feet tall. But they could handle a small tree, with of course, back then they had oxen to drag heavy things around. And there are ways, when I'm looking at an old building trying to figure it out, there are ways that we can tell that the wood came from a fairly small tree. It has different grain patterns, lots of knots. Whereas when you get into the big giant trees, it's beautiful straight grain wood. It's kind of what Louisiana is known for. Cypress. Well, Cypress is world famous, particularly for building boats. The early French houses were timber frame buildings, and they had an infill material.
Okay, is that what they call bousillage?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, if you can expand on that, because I found that pretty interesting. As a building material.
We were talking about the river. I was looking for this.
Okay. And I can show it to the camera afterwards, yeah. Or if you want to point it out.
Mm-hmm. I'm talking when you talk about the river, this is the river right here.
Okay.
And this is called a point. And the river meanders.
Okay.
These are called points. And the natural levee is immediately adjacent to the river, and then it tapers towards the back. The low point is the middle of the river, is the middle of the point. And all these properties taper to the back. It's good. Around here, it's called the back swamp.
Okay.
So this is where all the giant trees were growing. But the building...
Right in here.
Well, really, all along here. And all the building took place right up near the river.
Okay. And this is an example. Where would this be? Is this near Baton Rouge?
You see this Township 9 South, Range 1 East. And
okay.
Of course, I happen to know that it's this is called Plaquemine Point. Plaquemine Point, and this area right here. This is St. Gabriel.
Oh, okay.
And of particular interest for me is this little strip of land right here, which is where the St. Gabriel Church is.
Yeah, and I want to go into that too.
Yeah. So what the question you just asked was?
I forget.
Yeah.
Well, I did ask where. I guess where was this? Was this near Baton Rouge? But now that you said St. Gabriel, for people who don't know,
Yeah,
that's right south of Baton Rouge.
Yeah.
Going downriver.
Right. So this Township 9 South, Range 1 East, this is a system, a federal surveying system developed by Thomas Jefferson. And prior to Thomas Jefferson inventing his system of land division, these lines represent French and Spanish, the arpent system I talked about.
Okay. Instead of acres, they would say arpents.
Yeah. And so they fit the property to work with the the river, and if you look carefully, you can see that the land tapers.
Right. So it
Depending
starts small from the river, and then it kind of
It's
flares out.
correct. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So you see on a big
Oh, I see.
a
Yeah,
sharp,
right here.
a
Yeah.
sharp curve. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing here. You can see it, but all of these are like that. They all taper.
And why would they do that? Why wouldn't it just be like rectangular?
You know, it's on my to-do list because I'm working in St. Gabriel again. I think it was the Spanish that developed the tapered system because the English did it in a rectangular fashion.
To me, I guess it's more efficient, right? There's more access points for each of these properties for that river.
Well, my understanding is that it was a way because the land was considered. You get to the back of the property and it's swamp. You know, the elevation goes towards the back, and it was a way to establish equity. So it was something about having as much as your neighbor. Something,
I see. Okay.
Something about equity. I haven't really looked into it yet.
Yeah.
And again, I think it was the Spanish that developed the system because it's actually kind of a brilliant solution.
Yeah. Now, speaking of the Spanish, and can you kind of divulge what you're doing at the old St. Gabriel Church? Like, why is that significant? What's the deal with that? Because I didn't even know about that church until I met you.
Well, it's a bit of a story that starts with the arrival of the Acadians.
Okay.
So Spain. So there's a war, right? That sometimes called the French and Indian War. The British win, and they sign a treaty in 1763. And of course, France is the loser. So the British give everything west of the Mississippi to the Spanish. The Spanish also owned what historically, no, it's still called the Florida parishes, and that's east. But the Florida parishes went all the way, including Florida. You know, Spain had owned that previous to the.
Yeah, I remember seeing a documentary about how the states were formed.
The
At one point, if you look at Florida, I guess if you're looking from like Pensacola, extending it westward, it kept going. The state of Florida would cut across, I guess, Mobile,
went all the way
Mississippi,
to the Mississippi
River. What we call the Florida parishes here in Louisiana, St. Tammany. What is that? Tangipahoa.
Yeah.
And it ended right here at the river.
Yeah, including Baton Rouge.
Okay.
Right. So, but you know the oldest city in Florida. What is it? St. Petersburg. Anyway, that's
St. Augustine.
Yeah,
right?
they're there in the 17th century.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, they come over in 1590 or something. I don't know. Well, Columbus, 1490, right? 1492. Yeah, so they're in the Caribbean, Florida parishes. British win the war. They give all the French. They don't give all the territory. They give all the territory west of the Mississippi to Spain, including the Isle of Orleans, which of which the Bayou Manchac is the northern boundary of the Isle of Orleans, right?
Okay.
You go down the Bayou Manchac to Lake Maurepas, Lake Pontchartrain. You go around, you come up the Mississippi River to Bayou Manchac. So it's an island because it's completely surrounded by water. It's not anymore. They closed the Bayou Manchac. But Spain, like I said, needs warm bodies because the British are just across the bayou. Spain has a little fort on the southern side. The British have a little fort on the northern side. So the Acadians, who have been up in Nova Scotia, get the ones that didn't pledge allegiance to the King of England in Nova Scotia get exiled. And Spain hears about this and puts the call out. You know, like, hear ye, we got free land. If you're Catholic, we've got free land for you in a place called Louisiana. So one of the groups that had been in Maryland, and I refer to that, they were in really, for all intents and purposes, they were in a concentration camp in Maryland because the British didn't want Catholics being part of their country. So they send different groups to 2 or 3 locations in Louisiana. One of those locations was St. Gabriel. As part of the deal, the Acadians demanded that they have a church. So the Spanish government builds a church. The Acadians come to St. Gabriel in 1767. The church gets built in 1774, not that long after. And we just learned recently, a friend of mine that's been doing the research, that the communication between the King of Spain, I forget what he's called. He's the king's right-hand man. So the communication, the letters that we see in the archives are from I think his name was Pontchartrain. The letters between Pontchartrain and the various governors, Spanish governors here in Louisiana. They were told to build a church, but they find out that there might have been as many as 14 houses that were built prior to the church. And Pontchartrain was scolding the governor. I want you to build a church because we promised it to the Acadians. And of course, the Acadians didn't have anything of value. They're instructed, the governor is instructed to appoint a man to go to New Orleans to meet a ship that was bringing Acadians to New Orleans. Go down there and meet them. Now, the ship had been lost at sea for 4 months. And the Spanish, he was a lieutenant, he was told to bring them clothes, but don't buy new clothes. Bring them used clothes.
Oh, man.
And he was also told he could bring a calf. So he's on the dock with the calf. And the ship comes in. The people get off the ship. They kill the calf right on the spot and eat it. They eat it raw? Right on the...
Oh, man,
yeah.
They didn't cook it? Oh, jeez.
They were starving to death.
Yeah.
So you can study the Acadians, and to this day, you got to go west of the Atchafalaya, I call it, over in what's called Acadiana, where you still get a sense of what it's like to be Acadian. I mean, there are plenty of Acadians in Baton Rouge and all over the southern part of the state. But if you go west of the Atchafalaya, you're in Acadiana. And there's lots of folklore and musicians that still sing those old, sad Acadian songs about what a hard life they had. They were treated badly everywhere they went. And, I say it's because they were Catholics. I think of our country as, it was settled by British people. Not settled's the wrong word. It was founded by British people. And again, they don't like, especially French Catholics.
Yeah. So these people get off the river. Are their churches built?
No, they get brought to St. Gabriel.
Okay.
1767. And the church begins construction 1774.
Okay.
Gets completed in 1776. And still down there to this day, except that it got remodeled. This is what it looks like today.
Okay.
And it by the way, I do have this map, which is a Spanish map, an undated Spanish map, and this is St. Gabriel right here, and these are the two. This is the Bymanchak I spoke about. That's the British fort, and that's the Spanish fort.
I see. Okay.
Tiny little things, just not big forts like we would think of, but tiny little forts. And
what year? So this is in the 1760s.
This map. You can't see it, but if you look real close, you can see these land divisions, just like you see on this map. And written on each one is the name of an Acadian family. These are the families that came on that ship. So this map was created in advance of the Acadians getting here. It was created by a Spanish surveyor, map maker, showing each family where their property was going to be, including the location of the church and the forts.
Yeah, I see that this comes from the Biblioteca Nacional de España, the National Library of Spain.
Yeah. And
they were master record keepers, from what
Yes.
you've told me, and a previous guest of ours told us. Yeah.
The citation for that map shows a date of 1735 with a question mark. And we know it can't be that early. But that's one of the vagaries of doing historic research, is that a lot of times it just raises more questions than you get answers for. That a culture that was as good, they're known as fabulous map makers and record keepers, but they put a date of 1735, and that just can't be. It would be more like 1760. Again, prior to 1767.
Okay.
So the written history of building the church talks about the Acadians, or let me back up. The local historian down there, likes to tell the story of his Acadian ancestors building the church, and they may have assisted. They could have been laborers for sure, but the church, for its time, still to this day, it's a magnificent thing to behold. Completely handmade, surely built by professional carpenters. Again, we have records. We know who the builder was. He was a Frenchman. Came from west of the Chafalaya. The Opelousas Post preceded St. Gabriel by about 10 years or so. And so the builder that they brought to St. Gabriel was a known builder and had professionals. So, I can look at the timber frame and recognize the level of quality of all the handmade methods that were used in building a timber frame church, squaring the lumber and timber joinery, mortise and tenon with pegs, all that kind of stuff. So I know the church was built and probably cost quite a bit of money. And I just imagine back then somebody coming up the river and seeing this building that I refer to as cathedral size.
Yeah.
And just imagine in 1760s and 70s what people must have thought of that. They'd never seen anything like that. And it's been remodeled. The tower, pretty sure I have a drawing or a picture or something. Yeah, I do.
So this church has a historical designation? Is it a national whatever the designations are that are a sign of these?
It's on the National Register of Historic Places, but it's not a National Historic Landmark, which is a higher designation.
Oh.
That we're trying to
trying to attain, huh?
Trying to look into. Yeah. Here are some drawings, but this drawing right here, this one right here, was drawn. It's conjectural. You see how it has. Really, it's a gallery. Can you see that?
I can. Yeah.
We could call it a porch, but it's a gallery, and it's not here. The gallery used to come off the sides, right there.
I see. Yeah.
And the tower, it's not this tower. It's the earliest tower. It's smaller. So at some point, the church was moved. And the anecdotal history is that it was moved from being up by the fort, but we don't believe that to be the case. We think it was built in St. Gabriel. I'm a little confused here.
Well, why would they have gotten rid of this feature, this gallery, this outer porch? Because that's pretty nice looking.
Yeah. Again, because it was moved.
Oh, okay.
And it's actually been moved 3 times that we know of. Because one of the features of the river these bends in the river, right? The point, this bank here, right, is opposite the point. This is a point right here. So the river, over time, grows in this direction. The points grow. This is called the cut bank. The river.
This portion right here.
Yeah.
The part of the river that,
The
if I'm looking at like a sea, this is the river right
yeah.
here.
Yeah.
This is
The
the cut
river.
bank.
The strongest current of the river is on the outside of the bend. You know, the river actually moves faster, so it eats away. So
that moving water just eventually chips away at the land there.
Yeah, the point grows in this direction,
I see.
and it disappears. You know, it's called a cut bank, or sometimes the cave bank. It just falls into the river as the water eats it away. So the church, when you do the map research, there are maps called USGS maps that show these property lines at their current location when the map was made. So these lines actually run into the river and show you how much it's moved over a certain period of time.
Yeah.
So I was able to determine that the church used to be a quarter of a mile this way. People find that hard to believe, but you know, I mean, that's just a known fact. That's why if you go up there today, this side of the river is lined with concrete to try and prevent, even though there are levees, the river would still eat away at the bank. Matter of fact, what it does, it gets, in some places, it'll actually get underneath that concrete, and they have to, in many cases, they have to move the levee. They have to rebuild the levee farther back.
And who's doing that today? The Army Corps of Engineers?
Corps of Engineers.
Okay.
And so there are maps, they're called levee setback maps, that not only show the former position of a levee and the current position of where the new one's going to go, it also shows all the buildings that had to be moved. So that's how I was able to determine that the church had been moved back a quarter of a mile. And the house I'm currently working on was built on the property immediately adjacent to the church property. So we know. So you asked why the gallery was removed, and I said because it was moved.
Yeah.
The tower was blown off by Hurricane Betsy, which was when you weren't alive.
No, yeah, I think in the 60s or 70s, right? I always get mixed up between Betsy and Camille.
Yeah, I think Betsy was in the 50s.
Oh, okay.
Because I came down, I think it was Camille, that hit the Gulf Coast so bad, like Biloxi and stuff. And that was in the 60s. Because when I came down here in 65, I drove, and I drove along the coast. And yeah, it was that I saw the
remnants,
aftermath.
Yeah.
So that got blown, and then it got. So they didn't rebuild it. It was another 20 years, but it got blown off again. This tower was rebuilt in 74. But it was rebuilt as it existed at the time. No, take that back. this tower was replaced during the last move, and not this tower, but a tower that looked just like this in I think it was 1888.
Okay.
And then it got blown down again twice.
Well, these
in
hurricanes.
in the 50s and in the 70s.
Hurricanes are a pesky thing here, huh?
Yeah.
Man.
So we did a lot of research in, see what the date is on here. We did these kind of drawings with students, with architecture students. This is 1993. So they're called Historic American Building Survey drawings. And they're measured drawings. And so we did this set of drawings. And then the guy you were watching on the video, Dr. J. Edwards, did a study of the building. He and I and a guy named Dave Broussard, who did a lot of the research. These are dated 94. But it was, you see how this is called an interpretive restoration. So we wanted to establish what it looked like when it was first built. So we show the galleries and those drawings. These are two other colonial churches. One was in New Roads, and one was in this is in west of the Chaffaly. I forget it gets exactly. Gone. Both of these have been long gone, but they were put in here to show that when they were first built, they had a different appearance. What nowadays gets called Creole. So back in the 90s, we were thinking that the church could be restored to its original appearance. But the old people in the community that got married in this church, right, were having no part of it. You know? And this building, Dave did the math, is about 90% original. You know, all this timber framing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's primarily this tower, which represents that 1888 remodeling that the old people didn't want to change. So this is the way it looks today.
Yeah. So I guess, is that going to be a problem to get that higher historical designation?
I think it would have to be restored. And maybe that even wouldn't get it, because they're real particular at that level, and they probably prefer that it be in its original appearance.
Okay. Okay.
Because also when you go in this, the old church versus the new church, when you go inside, it got changed a little bit, and it has kind of a raised ceiling. And again, you can go up and down the river and see churches like this. We figure they must have copied this one, and so that's what most of the old churches look like. And they also cut the old ceiling out and created this sort of a raised ceiling. You know, and you go in a lot of old churches today, and this is what you're going to see is this raised ceiling part. But the original church didn't have that. So that's about the biggest change. And plus the Catholic Church has an unusual way they sort of run the church. They let the individual priests make a lot of the decisions about the church. So the priest at the time was also opposed because the church sits vacant today. They built a new church in 1953. So it just sort of sits there as an empty building, which is an empty building is hard to get insured, for example. So it's what's the term? They're self-insured.
I see. Oh, so it's not even in use as a working church. The mass isn't said.
No, they moved the bell. It had an original Spanish bell, dated 1769 or something. When it was made, I guess. They moved that into the new church.
Okay.
Along with, what do they call it? In the Catholic Church, they have something that they keep in a little box.
The sacristy?
Is that
I
what
think
it's
so.
called?
Yeah, where they have the communion.
I was going to call it
I think
the
that's
host.
Yeah. I'm a bad Catholic, so
Yeah.
I forget.
Well, so that's what they actually decommissioned the church.
Okay.
And they moved the host into the
see.
new church. That's what makes it official somehow.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. Me not being a Catholic, I would have no clue, right?
Yeah.
Man, my buddies, my Portuguese buddies used to take me into Catholic churches. And as a Baptist, I went to the first Baptist church is in Providence, Rhode Island. I went to the second Baptist church in East Providence, Rhode Island. And it's just a big wooden box painted white.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is white. No decoration of any kind. And I would go into the Catholic churches, and it's like the whole thing was covered in gold, it seemed like. And so that's how different, the two religions can be.
I guess I can explain some of that maybe cultural differences between like the British and I guess the Latin-based Europeans, Latin being French or Spanish. Yeah. So you mentioned another house that you were working on in St. Gabriel. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah. So because I live in St. Gabriel, I would hear about this old church. So I was teaching at LSU. This was back, I think in the 80s, early 80s, maybe. I said, well, if that's really an old church, I should be able to tell. So I drove down there and crawled up underneath the building. Sure enough, it's an old handmade building. Right next door is this house. What some people would call a two-story house. But I started calling it the Commandant's house. And this was owned by, and everybody knew it as the LeBlanc house. And of course, people from around here, let's say Baton Rouge, knew the LeBlanc family because they were all attorneys. The men were attorneys, and one of the sons named Jules LeBlanc was kind of an infamous attorney. He and his brother Roger, and Roger was living in this house with his wife, and they invited me over to look at the house. And right away, boy, there was something different about this house. And what was different was the two-story nature of the house. Now, we could look at here's an older photograph, again from the 1880s, prior to it being moved. You know, to jump back a little bit, the levee, it was the 1927 flood that created the need to build what was called the modern levee. Because back then, even in the late 19th century, the levees were small. And so the 27 flood, and the 27 flood, the levee broke way up, even above New Roads. So you know how far that is. It was even above there. It's a place called Turkey Creek. So it flooded the West Bank, like I said, all the way to Opelousas. It didn't really flood on the East Bank. And it didn't even affect the east side of the river until they dynamited the levee below New Orleans. Did you know about that?
No.
So, you know, old people would certainly know it. But it's also a pretty significant element because I'm talking St. Bernard Parish when I say below New Orleans. Because the Parish line used to be right where Jackson Barracks is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right in Araby. Yeah.
So there are even pictures of the exact moment that the dynamite went off.
And why do they do that?
To keep New Orleans from flooding.
Okay.
You know,
So basically, they're diverting some of that river water.
Yeah, well, the river was up at the top of the levee, so it would have flooded if the river kept going up. It would have flooded. So they dynamited the levee to relieve all that pressure.
Holy cow!
And there are people live down there. You know, children and grandchildren.
And they had no input until
Still got the term red ass. They still got the red ass at the person who gave the order to blow up the levee.
Gee.
But it didn't flood up here. You know, it didn't flood because the west bank of the river is lower than the east bank. That's true. That's true all the way up the river. You mentioned the bluffs, the Highland Road. And I told you it went from the Mississippi River Valley goes from the bluff on Highland Road all the way to the bluff in Opelousas. That whole thing is the Mississippi Valley.
So at one point, if you're driving along Highland Road today in Baton Rouge, that would have represented the edge of the river at one point.
The river not only came up to the bluff, but there are, we call them drainages that come down. So when you drive around town, like drive along Perkins Road, you cross a drainage. When you go to the Lowe's, Segan Lane,
yes,
you cross. There's a big bayou that you cross. That's a drainage.
Is that Dawson?
The one on Perkins is Dawson's Creek.
Yeah.
And it goes into really Bayou de Planche starts right where you live, not far from where you live. Up at the top is the beginning of Bayou de Planche, and very quickly the when I say drainages, think of Dalrymple Drive. You're going past those lakes, and those lakes, that's Bayou de Planche. They just flooded them. There's a weir down on Stanford. They built a weir, and that holds the water to create those lakes.
I see. Yeah.
But if you're approaching the railroad bridge on Dalrymple, right, the golf course, the railroad bridge.
Yeah, they have a dog park right there near there. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's where that's also a bluff, right?
So the Mississippi River at one point, maybe thousands of years ago, would have.
When the water was high, it would go into all those drainages, all the way into Baton Rouge. Yeah.
Wow. And so we have a real issue. I mean, I remember in 2016, not too long ago, but I guess there were a lot of things that went on. There was a higher amount of rainfall that fell during that period. I think it was in the spring of 16. And like a lot of places just flooded around town. It didn't really get much national exposure.
Yeah. That's an ongoing, for example, I went and visited John Smart the other night and saw a sign in somebody's yard said, stop the flooding in the Garden District.
Yeah.
I was dumbfounded. That's high ground. How can it be flooding? John said the water got into his car. It got that high. You been to John's house?
Not yet, but I know where it is. Yeah.
I think it's drainage. It's just it's probably the original drainage. That subdivision was built the first part of the 20th century. 1910, 15, something like that.
Yeah, like Dreer Avenue.
Yeah, so it's probably the original pipes, original drainage.
Okay.
And it's just not adequate anymore. Some people say it's climate change, whatever. We have these really heavy rainstorms. And so when you get an area that's high, like that neighborhood is, they're really called flash floods. It's surface drainage is what it is, and it's raining so fast that it can build up faster than it can drain out.
I see.
And
yeah, we're just eternally fighting with water, whether you're in Baton Rouge or New Orleans, just anywhere in the Mississippi River Valley.
Yeah, and of course there's a lot of people, and I'm one of them. All that land down on Burbank, all that.
I remember, you told me that years ago that you would like walk some of these neighborhoods, and I mean, I guess to give people some insight, like maybe 100 years ago or longer, just the area around LSU was just swamp at one point.
Yeah, it was an oil field.
Okay.
Oil
built in this like swamp, basically, right?
Yeah. Because it's the floodplain, the alluvial floodplain of the Mississippi River. It's only the levees, the modern levees, that separate it from being flooded anymore. If the levee was to break, say Baton Rouge, my property would flood. It would flood all the way to New Orleans.
Holy cow!
Because it's all in the valley. So getting back to this house, you can drive around. Not so much Baton Rouge, but certainly going west of the Atchafalaya, up and down Bayou Lafourche. That's a good place. If people want to see what Louisiana used to look like, drive up and down the Bayou Manchac, both sides, because it's got the greatest collection of remaining 19th, late 18th century houses. And most of them have this appearance, by which I mean Acadian style. Is that what you would call this? Are you?
Everything to me looks like Acadian.
You're a New Orleans guy, so you're not as familiar with
Yeah.
Certainly going west of the Atchafalaya. You probably haven't been there much, have
Not
you?
much, yeah.
Yeah. But this, I actually, I like to tell people, you have a rectangular solid, that's the body of the house.
Okay.
You have a rectangular void, which is the front gallery. Oh, there you
yeah.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you brought that.
Yeah.
But I remember in one of our discussions when you first showed me this little model,
Yeah.
kind of, I guess you're deconstructing the shapes of a house.
Yeah. Rectangular solid, rectangular void with a triangle on the top.
Okay.
That's the most common house type.
In Louisiana?
We're talking old houses.
Okay.
Yeah. In South Louisiana.
Okay. And generally, we would call that an Acadian style of architecture.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I wouldn't necessarily use that term because the term Creole, and Creole, back when I was starting out, and for the first 20 years, people didn't use the term Creole. Nowadays, you can go to New Orleans and people refer to themselves as being Creole.
Yeah, we just had a guest on previous, Jeremy Simeon,
Uh-huh.
and he discussed about the history of Creole, the Creole community.
So my understanding is, now this is from Jay Edwards, the guy in the video,
Okay.
he's the current expert. He's been writing his definition of Creole for about 30 years. He's certainly the most well-published on the subject of Creole. And he describes it as being, and again, it's a Spanish term that means of this location. Parents born in Europe, and if they have a child in the New World, they're Creole. He's writing about buildings. He's trying to describe why buildings are considered Creole.
Oh, okay. So, yeah.
So he shows us, beginning with Christopher Columbus's son, who, by Jay's definition, is supposed to have built the first European-style building in the New World, and it has a courtyard. And the courtyard, when the Spanish come to New Orleans, some people say they're responsible for the courtyards that are in New Orleans.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. Like in the French Quarter, yeah.
But there are only 3 buildings in the entire French Quarter that get credited as being real Spanish buildings. In large part because of there were 2 fires in the French Quarter, 1788 and 1794. And the 1788 fire, at that time, all the buildings in the quarter were wooden buildings, timber frame buildings.
Holy cow. Made of cypress?
Yeah. Had wooden roofs. So about 80% of the buildings are burned. Now, the Spanish are in control at this point, right, from 1760, 67, right? Then they have another fire in 1794 that burns the rest of all those buildings. So we have no buildings except for the Ursuline convent that survived prior to 1788. In fact, if you Google oldest house, the
In what?
Madam,
In the French Quarter?
yeah, Madam John's legacy will come up.
Let's see. The oldest building in Louisiana and the Mississippi Valley is a stately convent of the Ursulines at 1100 Charter Street. Yep, there's 15 of the oldest buildings in the French Quarter. One of them is Madame John's legacy.
And they give that a date of 1788, which is the date of the fire. And the significance of that to me is this house in St. Gabriel, we think, was built for the commandant, for the Spanish commandant, this house, I'm using a date of 1770. Now, there are other buildings. Lafitte's blacksmith shop is on that list of the 15 oldest, and a couple of others, but I'm not convinced that they're as old as some people think they are. Nonetheless, I'm pretty well convinced this is the oldest house, what people like to call a house.
Oh.
But I call it the Spanish commandant's house. But I get real particular. Like I said earlier, they're all old buildings. So if we have a house and a church, they're both old buildings, but one's a house and one's a church. This building was built by the government as a government building, the commandant's house.
Okay.
So I don't even like to think of it as a house.
I guess not in the classical sense of like residential built by a private person.
But the people that currently own this house want to find evidence that Bernardo de Galvez stayed here.
I've heard that name. Who is that?
He came over. He's a military guy. So he makes his bones as a military guy in some Spanish war somewhere in Europe. So he gets sent over here, and he gets tasked. They want him to run the British out, get rid of the British in the Florida parishes.
Okay.
Which again is right across the bayou.
Right? By a Manchac.
Just from, physically from St. Gabriel, it's maybe 3 miles. The Bayou Manchac from St. Gabriel. So he starts in New Orleans, and he's marching by land. He's marching up the river, and he's collecting people along the way to be part of his militia. So there are slaves that get recruited, Spanish people from the Canary Islands, and different sort of mixed group. By the time he gets to St. Gabriel, he's got 1,400 people in the militia. So the people that own this house, he gets appointed governor. After that, he gets appointed governor in 1770 something.
Here, I'll Google some of this information
I
here.
think there are maybe half a dozen governors, Spanish governors. But the people want you to think that he actually lived here at some point.
And what's your contention? Do you think he did?
Yeah, there's a pretty good chance.
Yeah.
Certainly, he stayed here. But more than that, what they want people to know is the first skirmish of the American Revolution was when they go to the Bayou Manchac and run the British out of their fort. There weren't but 8 guys in the British fort. There were 1,400
Right.
Spanish army.
Commanded by this
guys.
Bernardo de Galvez.
So they just sort of threw their guns down and ran off.
Yeah.
But it could very well be the first skirmish of the American Revolution. This is 2 years prior, right, to 1776.
Wow. So you've been commissioned to what? How are you involved in this house? With some of the restoration?
She told me she wanted to know what the house could have looked like when it was first built.
And when you think about it, Madame John's legacy, I'm looking at the house. I recognize that house. That was used in the film Interview with a Vampire.
Okay.
Yeah, they used that as a backdrop.
Let me see
yeah,
that.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I can see some of the similar features between this house you're working on and
Yeah. What?
I guess with the second floor porch, some of the similar characteristics. Yeah.
Yeah. So the prior to being involved with this, I used to say that all old buildings in South Louisiana are raised off the ground. You remember I told you about the crawl space?
Mm-hmm.
But they're raised off the ground, sometimes with just piers, short piers. Could have been before brick, could have been just sections of a cypress tree, but they were raised off the ground. By the time they started using brick, as the case here, that first story is made out of brick.
Oh.
So I refer to old buildings in Louisiana as being single story, raised on piers.
Okay, I see.
This house, the ground floor is timber frame, just like the upper story. In fact, it's all the pieces of wood are bigger than the upper story. If I look at this part, it's fairly typical. The lower part is oversized. The only other place I know of for pieces of wood that were that big, 8x8s, 10x10s, is the church. So I'm also convinced that the same guy that built the church built this building as well.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And we have documentation that the builder of the church owned this property at one time. So that's, when I say we have evidence, that's pretty good evidence because by and large, when you're doing research on buildings this old and you have some kind of land sale record, it rarely, if ever, tells you there's a building on the property. It's boilerplate language in legal documents. It refers to, it'll describe the land, so it's a description of land. Still, when you bought your house, you probably didn't have a map. Nobody gave you a map. What you got was a legal description, and it describes the boundaries of the property in surveyor's terms.
Okay.
North, 26 degrees, 30 minutes, 19 seconds,
Mm-hmm.
north, and then, it'll describe the boundaries.
Is that a Louisiana?
Yes, it's called a legal description,
Okay.
and it began in the colonial period.
Okay.
You didn't need a map. If you were in Anglo territory, up New England, the British guys drew the map first.
Oh.
So you bought your house with a map. So when you read a legal description, the phrase, it'll say this land is being sold with all the appurtenances thereupon, and that's could be a house, could be a barn. In Louisiana, there's it's called movable and immovable property. So houses were considered immovable, but movable property could be sheep or cattle or chickens or anything. It could be wood that you've cut down, anything that's,
Yeah. I guess in modern terms, that could be like a trailer, like a movable.
No,
No?
not a trailer. Because when I years ago, every lawyer I would meet, there's a if you go to law school at LSU, anywhere in Louisiana, I guess you still do. I don't know. You get a copy. You have to buy it yourself. And they used to be made here in Baton Rouge at Clater's bookstore, of the 1805 Civil Code. It was a French Civil Code in 1805. And it's fascinating to read, but it describes, movable and immovable property. And I used to ask attorneys, okay, I'm one of the things I do in my work is we move historic buildings. So what do you call a building when you put it on the trailer and you drive it off the property?
Yeah.
And most attorneys I've asked didn't have an answer. They would have to research it. But one guy, and now it's been confirmed, it stays immovable property. It's just a quirk in the law.
Yeah. And I know we don't have time, so we got to wrap up, but I wanted to explore the how do you pronounce that? The Aile house that you helped move?
Allier.
Allier, yeah.
Yeah.
And we'll put a link in this description of the video for people to take a look at that documentary, because I thought that was fascinating.
Have you seen the church one? The
Yeah,
St.
I
Gabriel
did.
Church?
I did, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because as part of your career, you were a consultant in like moving houses, some of these buildings.
Yeah, moved lots of buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And the Allier was a house that was this is the Allier house.
Okay. Okay.
This was on the River Road, and we moved it into Port Allen. It's it's the West Baton Rouge Historic Museum. I've done lots of museums, done museums in other states. But it's my favorite museum. I've done a lot of work at Magnolia Mound Plantation in Baton Rouge. And I met a girl who was studying at LSU. She was studying museum studies, and she specialized in how do you present difficult subjects in a museum environment. So she got a PhD in studying slavery in a museum environment, and became the director of the West Baton Rouge Historic Museum. And so there's an older building, not older than this, but West Baton Rouge existed in a building before I brought this one there. But since I brought this one there, they've brought in another 10 or 15 buildings.
Oh, wow.
From a plantation that's in West Baton Rouge Parish. And most recently, they got a woman a woman who has the it's called the River Road African American Museum in Donaldsonville. So they hired her to create a juke joint.
Okay.
And this other stuff is all behind this house. And the juke joint, they created a blues program. So Kenny Neal, have you heard of Kenny? The Neals, the Neal family, and they're from around Port Allen. Their father, he's passed away now, but if you go to Phil Brady's here in Baton Rouge,
Mm-hmm.
the local juke joint,
Mm-hmm.
the father used to play there, and he had like 11 kids, and they're all musicians. So Kenny's one of his most successful sons, and they got Kenny to start a blues program in the high school over there. And so they have all kinds of things that happen at this site, including, musicians playing in the juke joint that got created. It's a kind of a replica juke joint. But just my favorite museum, just fabulous. They have all kind of events there.
Yeah, I went there once to listen to a presentation on the Preak tobacco industry.
okay.
Yeah, it
So
was years ago.
Yeah. So you were in the little auditorium room
Yeah.
of the first building that was there.
Yeah, I don't really remember the layout, but
Yeah. This is just to the left of it.
okay. Yeah.
And you have to, and it's an interesting building in many ways, not the least of which is it's a transition building, and I guess we don't have time to go into that.
We'll get you on again. Yeah. But why don't you tell me quickly? What do you mean transition?
Well, I have by the way, this model is one of about 20 that I have, and they're all buildings that I've worked on. They're all my projects.
Oh wow.
So I usually have another one to show you. I can compare it to. Matter of fact, I brought a. Oh, I can't find it. Oh, it's one of these.
Okay. Here, I can help you.
It's this one. This is the Allier house right here. That's this one.
Let's take a look here.
And I like to compare it to this one because this is I like to refer to this one. This is the oldest house in Baton Rouge, built by the Kleinpeter family. 1790, 1830.
Okay. Wow.
So if I had my model here, I would compare the floor plans and why I consider this transitional. You see this back here is a hallway. You see how
Yeah, I see it.
You see how you come in the front door. This is a room, right? This is a room. This is a hallway. It's actually a stair hall going upstairs. An older house, this house, doesn't have a central hall. People like to associate central halls with Louisiana buildings, but it's an Anglo. The Anglos brought that in at a later time.
Okay.
The earlier French style houses didn't have that. You walked right into this was a bedroom. This is what we would call a living room. It's called a salle, S-A-L-L-E, salle and chambre.
Yeah, in Spanish it would be sala.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And these rooms back here, in the old style floor plan, were called cabinets. They were auxiliary rooms to the two front big rooms. But the curious thing about this house, you can see it here.
Oh, the
When you walk up to the house, you see how those two front doors, those two front doors, you can just see a little bit of this one.
mm-hmm.
The two front doors, they're equal. So how do you know which door you go up to?
Yeah. Which one will go into the bedroom? Which one will go into the...
Whereas this one, you know, a door and two windows. A door and a window.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
It's and this room is bigger than this room. These two rooms are equal.
I see. Yeah.
So it was obvious. This front door was obvious. But the thing that distinguishes the gallery in Louisiana, this was a room. People slept. The term is sleeping porch today.
You mean this would be an outdoor space? People would sleep there?
People would, they would weave. The women would weave on the front porch. They'd do all kind of things. They'd eat on the front porch. These were small. This is a small house. French people, Catholic people, they had 12, 15 kids.
Okay.
I've got a...
So that space is pretty valuable for like other activities besides just sleeping or...
I worked Ernest Gaines, autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, Louisiana's most famous author, Ernest Gaines, grew up in New Roads on False River at a place called River Lake Plantation. And the slave quarters and the slave cabins that he grew up in were still there when I worked on that property 35 years ago, maybe. And his mother was the cook at the big house. So they lived up front at the slave quarters, 30 buildings, 15 in a row, everyone exactly the same.
Okay.
So he lived up front because his was actually his aunt was the cook at the big house. Anyway, he can remember when they brought electricity. Electricity didn't come to most of the rural country till they created the Rural Electrification Commission in 1947. Prior to that, people in the country, if you didn't have a what was called a Delco plant, in other words, a generator, and so I worked on a store that still had the generator. Ernest Gaines said people would come at night and they'd sit around on the floor, they'd sit around with their backs against the wall and stare at the light bulb in the middle of the room. The most amazing thing they'd ever seen in their lives.
Yeah.
But those slave cabins, he said they would have, some families would have 20 children, all living in one room.
Jeez.
So there's this whole, I could go on for an hour at least, describing the evolution of floor plans. And so the earliest buildings were just two rooms side by side. And then it evolves over time. And so by the time 1830, this guy was probably a doctor, could have been a lawyer. This was a nice house, even though it was tiny.
But by those standards back then, that it was nice.
Yeah. And then I didn't show you this, which is my conjectural drawing for the St. Gabriel house.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So you asked me. She hired me to tell her what it might have looked like when it was first built. And these galleries, same thing, got moved twice, maybe 3 times. And the galleries got taken off. But one of the more significant things about timber frame buildings is the attics and the kind of again, we call them trusses. And I used to take my classes up into the attic. Can't do it anymore. Back then, liability wasn't as much of an issue as it is now. But you see that all this, boy, it's...
Yeah, I can see it. Yep. So this would be part of the attic?
Yeah.
And you're showing us the old St. Gabriel Church?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
wow.
So that's one of there are a lot of things I look at to establish the age of a building. And that's one of them. So if somebody wanted me to create a tour, and it would be for serious people that know old buildings. So it would be for really serious people that know what they're looking at. Matter of fact, I did that. Two guys were writing a book in Illinois, because as you know, the French also settled in Illinois, St. Louis, St. Genevieve, which is fairly close to St. Louis.
What about Louisville, Kentucky?
No, St. Louis.
Yeah, but also, what about Louisville? I think that had French.
Yeah, I've never been there.
Okay.
So but St. Genevieve is really the place that still has the appearance of an old French village, but they're completely different kind of buildings. I forget where I was going with that.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there, Sid. We appreciate you coming in tonight. But look, before we wrp it up, because I'd like to get you on it, we could probably have talked here for another 2, 3, 4 hours.
Yeah, I feel like I'm just getting started.
Yeah, I know. No, but we'll have you on again for sure, because there's so many aspects I wanted to. We didn't even touch on. But before we end it tonight, we're trying to do a segment here called the Final Puff. So these will be 3 rapid questions and answers. Don't think about it. So we'll start. So first one, Tabasco or Crystal?
Neither.
Okay. Favorite vacation destination?
Asheville, North Carolina.
And the ideal person you would want to smoke a cigar with, alive or dead?
Fred Niffen.
Okay. Well, that does it, Sid. I appreciate you coming on tonight. Thanks again.
Thanks.
We'll have you on again. All right, sir. Bye-bye. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope you found today's conversation insightful and entertaining. If you enjoyed this episode and want to discover more episodes, check us out at thelifepuro.com or any other major streaming platform. If you're interested about the cigars we smoked, you can visit us at shop.habanaport.com. Until the next cigar, thank you.